I'm Caleb Rourke. I spent most of my adult life as a civil engineer, the kind who gets called in after something goes wrong and everyone wants to know why. When I retired, I didn't want another project with deadlines and meetings. I wanted quiet, wood dust, and the land my grandfather left me. So I moved back to the edge of Pine Hollow Creek and turned the old barn into a small woodworking shop, where my biggest concern was grain direction and humidity, not politics. My property sits just outside Redwillow Ridge, a gated HOA that didn't exist when my family bought the land. Over the last decade, it grew around me like ivy, neat streets, and identical houses pressing up against 12 acres that refuse to conform. On 3 sides, there are protected wetlands and creek buffers. No road can legally cut through them. One stone bridge connects my land to the county road. That's it, no alternate route. No emergency bypass. Anyone who understands infrastructure knows what that means. Anyone who doesn't pretends it's inconvenient instead of absolute. My grandfather built that bridge in 1923. He was an engineer before the title was fashionable, the kind of man who trusted math more than optimism. He surveyed the banks himself, calculated bearing loads by hand, and built in margins because he assumed someone someday would try to push it harder than they should. The bridge was stone-faced, but inside it carried quiet complexity, drainage channels, expansion gaps, conduit sleeves for future utilities. Every morning, when I walked it, I checked the same things he taught me to check. Mortar joints, deflection, the faint hiss of water moving through pipes embedded below, the subtle vibration when power demand spiked in the early hours. For years after Redwillow Ridge went up, the HOA mostly ignored me. I wasn't part of their association. I didn't attend meetings or pay dues. Some residents waived. A few ordered custom furniture from my shop. It was a neutral coexistence, and that suited me fine. That changed when Lydia Hargrove took over. Lydia didn't come in like a tyrant. She came in like a professional. Polished emails. Careful language. A tone that suggested she was managing problems rather than creating them. Her first letter wasn't about safety or access. It was about appearance. The barn's exterior didn't meet community standards. The workshop sign suggested commercial activity. She used phrases like visual consistency and long-term value. I wrote back politely, explained that I wasn't in the HOA, that the barn predated the neighborhood, that the sign had been there for decades. I even thanked her for reaching out. Her response came quickly, and it was different. She started mentioning timelines, investor expectations, how the community had committed to a new clubhouse as part of a broader growth plan, how delays could affect financing. She didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. Redwillow Ridge was under pressure to deliver, and pressure flows downhill. I heard more through the grapevine. Residents talked about special assessments, board meetings that ran late, Lydia fielding calls from people who didn't live there but had money tied up in its future. She wasn't inventing urgency, she was drowning in it. That's why the bridge mattered. It was the shortest route, the cheapest route, the one that made schedules possible. Using the approved county access road added time and cost. Cutting across my land saved both. On paper, it probably looked like an easy decision. In reality, it was a gamble that ignored limits my grandfather had set a century earlier. When Lydia spoke to me in person for the first time, she didn't threaten me. She appealed to reason, at least her version of it. She talked about shared responsibility, about adapting old infrastructure to modern needs, about how communities can't be held hostage by individual preferences. What she didn't say was that she needed that bridge. She needed it to hold just long enough. She needed it to carry weight it was never designed for, because failure on her timeline meant professional consequences she wasn't ready to face. That kind of pressure makes people rationalize things they'd otherwise know better than to try. I saw it clearly because I'd seen it before. just in different contexts. Projects where warnings were logged and ignored, where engineers flagged risk and managers rephrased it as pessimism, where everyone hoped the structure would last one more cycle. The difference this time was that the structure belonged to my family, and I knew exactly how it would behave when pushed past its limits. When the first heavy truck crossed, I felt it through my boots, not just vibration, but a change in resonance. The bridge's natural frequency shifted slightly under load, subtle but unmistakable. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding that resolved itself. Lydia wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to survive her own deadline, and that made what was coming not just predictable, but inevitable. The construction trucks started showing up a week later, almost to the day, not all at once. Just enough at first to test the water, a flatbed early in the morning, a dump truck just before dusk, each one crossing the bridge a little slower than normal, like the drivers could feel something wasn't quite right under their tires. Then the cement mixers arrived. The logo on the doors made my stomach tighten. Hargrove Construction. Lydia's cousin, Brent Hargrove. Redwillow Ridge had hired his company to build the new clubhouse, the one investors were already advertising in glossy brochures. There was an approved county access road for commercial traffic. It was longer, narrower, and cut into Brent's margins. So the drivers were instructed to take the shorter route, my route. One truck became two became 4 a day. Fully loaded cement mixers, drums spinning, each carrying well over 30 tons. I didn't need sensors to know that was more than double what the bridge was designed to carry. I could hear it in the way the stone responded, the low-frequency groan as compressive forces redistributed, the sharp click when tensile stress began pulling at mortar that had held steady for 100 years. The first time I stopped a driver, he looked genuinely confused. I pointed to the posted weight limit sign, 15 tons. Clearly marked. I explained it wasn't an HOA access road. It was private property. He nodded, apologized, and said he'd radio it in. The next truck crossed an hour later, so I put up more signs. Private property, no commercial vehicles. Weight limit enforced. I installed temporary barriers at both ends of the bridge. The following morning, the barriers were gone, not damaged. Removed cleanly, like someone didn't want to leave evidence of how little my objections mattered. I finally tracked down Brent in person. He was supervising a pour near the clubhouse site, boots dusty, hard hat tilted back. When I told him his trucks were destroying my bridge, he didn't deny it. He didn't even look surprised. The HOA cleared it, he said, casual as if that settled everything. Talk to Lydia. Within days, the bridge began to show measurable damage. Hairline fractures formed along the mortar joints at the center span, exactly where shear forces would concentrate under repeated overload. One support stone rotated just enough to create a visible gap. Deflection increased by millimeters, nothing dramatic to an untrained eye, but unmistakable to someone who'd spent decades studying failure patterns. I called Lydia. She listened, at least on the surface. When I explained the load limits, the documentation, the visible damage, she sighed like someone dealing with an inconvenient delay. She said the project was already behind schedule, that rerouting trucks would cost money, that investors were watching progress closely. You're asking me to slow everything down over a bridge that's already a century old, she said. From a risk perspective, that doesn't make sense. I told her plainly that if the crossings continued, the bridge would fail. She paused, then said something that stuck with me. We can't design a community around one person's attachment to outdated infrastructure. It wasn't cruel. It was managerial. That was the part that made it dangerous. After that call, the traffic increased. Crossings happened earlier in the morning and later at night. Drivers idled mid-span longer than necessary, letting the drum rotate while the bridge carried static load it had never been meant to hold. Diesel fumes settled into my workshop. Vibrations disrupted glue-ups and split a table I'd spent weeks on. Clients started canceling when delivery timelines slipped. Each incident alone could have been dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern. Pressure applied slowly, consistently, with plausible deniability baked in. That's when it stopped feeling like negligence and started feeling like intent. Lydia wasn't ordering anyone to break the bridge. She didn't need to. She just needed to keep saying no to alternatives, to keep insisting the schedule mattered more than the warnings. If the bridge failed, it would look like an unfortunate consequence of age, not the predictable result of overload. That's how people under deadline pressure rationalize risk. They don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as practical. I stopped confronting drivers after that, stopped calling Brent, stopped trying to persuade Lydia, because persuasion assumes the other person is still weighing options. They weren't. They'd already chosen the outcome they needed. They were just hoping physics would cooperate long enough to get there. And every time a mixer rolled onto the stone, I could feel the bridge inch closer to the answer it had been warning about all along. I stopped arguing after that, not because I ran out of words, but because words were no longer the point. Lydia wasn't making decisions based on persuasion or principle. She was managing risk on a calendar. And when someone does that, the only language that matters is documentation. So I treated the bridge like a failing structure on a forensic job. I installed fixed cameras at both approaches, positioned to capture axle placement, tire deformation, and dwell time on the span. Every camera synced to an independent clock source, so there could be no argument about timing later. I added discrete weight sensors near the abutments, calibrated to log axle loads automatically. Each crossing was recorded, measured, and stored off-site. I began a strict inspection routine, morning and evening. Same order every time. I photographed the same stones, the same joints, the same hairline fractures, marking them with grease pencil so I could track propagation. What had started as micro-cracking in the mortar was now developing into visible shear planes. Tensile forces were pulling the joints apart faster than the lime mortar could redistribute load. Deflection at the center span increased incrementally, exactly as the equations predicted. Then I pulled my grandfather's original plans. They were still in a steel tube in the workshop loft, tied with twine, his handwriting faded but legible. Load tables. Safety factors. Margin notes about seasonal water flow and freeze-thaw cycles. He'd rated the bridge conservatively at 15 tons, assuming uneven loading and slow crossings. Anything above that, repeatedly applied, would accelerate fatigue and lead to brittle failure. The mixers were carrying more than double that, sometimes closer to 3 times. I compiled everything into a formal report and sent a cease and desist letter to both Lydia and Brent. Certified delivery. Clear language, no emotion. I cited private property law, posted weight limits, and documented structural damage tied directly to commercial overload. They didn't stop. Instead, Lydia escalated. 2 days later, she arrived with a county building inspector, all professional concern and careful phrasing. She told him she was worried the bridge posed a safety risk to the surrounding community, that its age alone made it suspect. It was a classic maneuver, reframing damage they caused as my negligence. I didn't argue. I let the inspector do his job. He measured deflection, examined the fracture patterns, and asked detailed questions about traffic loads. When I showed him the footage and sensor data, his posture changed. The cracks weren't random. They radiated from high-stress zones consistent with repeated overload. This wasn't age-related deterioration. It was induced failure. He wrote it down. The preliminary report recommended immediate restrictions on heavy vehicles and noted that continued commercial use would likely result in collapse. Lydia read the report carefully, nodded, and thanked him. Then she smiled, not a mocking smile, a tight one. The smile of someone who understands the risk but believes the cost of stopping is higher than the cost of continuing. She assumed the next move would be mine, that I'd be forced into expensive repairs, legal filings, and delays I couldn't afford. What she didn't know was that I'd already uncovered something far more serious. Late that night, I went back through the oldest easements tied to the property, not just the bridge structure but the foundation permits from the original build. That's when I saw the notation my grandfather had made almost as an aside: utility conduits embedded in the foundation. I'd always known they were there. I checked them every morning out of habit, the faint hiss of water flow, the bundled cables secured beneath the stone. But until I traced the records, I hadn't realized how much depended on them. Every major utility feeding Redwillow Ridge ran through that bridge. Power, water, communications. I cross-referenced county maps, utility company diagrams, and the HOA's own development plans. Lydia's expansion proposals promised guaranteed utility capacity through existing infrastructure corridors. Corridors she didn't own. Corridors she was actively damaging. That wasn't just poor judgment. That was exposure. I forwarded the entire file to Marissa Cole, a land use attorney I'd worked with years earlier. She called me back after reviewing it and said quietly, "If that bridge goes under their trucks, this stops being a dispute. It becomes a disaster." That was the turning point. Lydia still thought she was managing a schedule. She didn't realize she was racing a clock she couldn't outrun. Once I understood what the bridge really represented, my role in the situation changed. I stopped thinking like a homeowner being pressured and started thinking like an engineer managing an inevitable failure with known consequences. The bridge was no longer just something I needed to protect. It was a system node, a single point of failure tied to far more than my own access. And once you see a system clearly, you stop reacting and start planning. I met with Marissa in her office a few days later. I brought everything: the footage, the load data, the inspection logs, the county report, the easement records, the utility maps. I expected her to slow me down, to warn me about escalation or retaliation. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and said, "They've already crossed the line. You're just documenting how far. We didn't file anything immediately." That was intentional. Filing too early would have tipped Lydia off that the bridge was more than an inconvenience. It would have forced her to pivot, reroute trucks, maybe even slow the project just enough to avoid catastrophe. Marissa explained it plainly. If they stopped now, the damage would become a repair dispute. If they continued, it would become a liability event. The difference mattered. So we built a containment plan instead of an intervention. I upgraded the monitoring system, redundant cameras, off-site backups, weight-triggered alerts that logged not just load but duration, how long the bridge was forced to carry stress beyond design limits. I installed vibration sensors that recorded harmonic changes in the stone, the subtle shifts that occur right before structural failure. To anyone else, it would have looked obsessive. To me, it was standard procedure when you're watching a structure approach the end of its tolerance envelope. I also stopped trying to block access physically. That surprised people. One of my neighbors asked why I didn't just put up a gate or concrete barriers. The answer was simple. Anything that looked like obstruction would hand Lydia the narrative she wanted. She'd already painted me as the stubborn holdout delaying progress. I wasn't going to give her proof. Instead, I let the bridge do what it had always done: respond honestly to the forces applied to it. The pressure from the HOA intensified, emails framed as concerns about community cooperation, messages hinting at legal consequences if I interfered with construction. Lydia never threatened outright. She didn't need to. The implication was enough. She was still trying to manage risk, still believing she could balance just long enough to get past the finish line. What she didn't know was that the finish line didn't exist. In the evenings, I walked the bridge with a notebook and a flashlight. I marked crack propagation, measured rotation in individual stones, noted changes in sound when trucks slowed mid-span. The bridge had entered a stage of progressive failure where each overload didn't just add damage, it accelerated the next one. Load paths were redistributing unpredictably. Mortar was no longer absorbing stress evenly. Once that happens, collapse becomes less a possibility and more a scheduling issue. I could have warned her again. I chose not to. That decision wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility. Every warning had already been given. The signs were posted, the limits were documented, the county report existed. Continuing after that point wasn't ignorance. It was choice. Marissa prepared the legal framework quietly in the background. Draft complaints, emergency injunction language, environmental liability filings. We didn't submit them, but they were ready, time-stamped, and waiting. The moment something happened, there would be no scramble, no confusion, no room for narrative control. Then something else changed. The truck schedule tightened. Crossings became more frequent, closer together, heavier. I watched the data and felt the shift immediately. This wasn't casual convenience anymore. This was urgency. Someone had moved up a deadline. Investors, maybe, a funding milestone, a promised opening date. Whatever it was, it pushed Brent to run loads harder and Lydia to keep saying yes. That's when I realized they weren't just gambling. They were committed. Committed people don't slow down when the risk increases. They double down. They convince themselves they're almost through the dangerous part. Just a few more days. A few more loads. Then it'll be done. The bridge didn't care about any of that. Stone doesn't respond to confidence. It responds to force. Late one night, I reviewed the logs and saw the numbers spike past anything I'd recorded before. The margin was gone. The structure was operating in borrowed time. From an engineering standpoint, the system had entered an unstable state. Failure could happen on the next overload, or the one after that. There was no longer a question of if, only when. And when it happened, it wouldn't look like a gradual decline. It would look sudden, violent, inconvenient. Exactly the kind of failure people pretend couldn't have been predicted. I shut the notebook, saved the files, and set my alarms. The plan wasn't to stop what was coming. The plan was to be ready when physics finished the conversation Lydia had refused to have. The HOA didn't slow down after that. They sped up. What had been a steady flow of traffic turned into a near-constant presence. Trucks rolled in before sunrise and crossed well after dark. Cement mixers idled on the bridge longer than ever, their drums rotating lazily while drivers waited for clearance on the other side. Sometimes two vehicles would pause at opposite ends, forcing the span to carry asymmetric loads that twisted stress paths through stone that had never been meant to flex that way. It felt deliberate. My driveway was blocked more than once, always briefly, always with plausible deniability. A truck broke down in just the right place. A delivery was misrouted. When I complained, the apologies were polite and empty. Around the same time, anonymous complaints started landing with the county. Claims that my workshop was running industrial equipment at night, that I was violating zoning, that I was dumping waste into Pine Hollow Creek. Inspectors showed up, embarrassed before they even knocked. I walked them through the shop, showed permits, logs, waste disposal receipts. Every complaint collapsed under scrutiny. But each visit cost time, energy, and attention. That was the point. They wanted me exhausted. They wanted me reacting instead of observing. They wanted me to miss something. Instead, I let the systems keep watching. Every crossing triggered my alarms. Weight sensors logged axle loads and dwell times automatically. Vibration monitors tracked changes in resonance, subtle shifts that signaled redistribution of stress through the span. I stopped checking the data hourly and started reviewing it in blocks, like telemetry from a failing machine. The trend was unmistakable. Loads were heavier, pauses longer, safety margins non-existent. The bridge began to sound different at night. During the day, noise masked it. At night, when the creak was quiet, I could hear the structure working. A low, grinding murmur when a mixer slowed mid-span. A sharp pop as tensile forces pulled at mortar already weakened by shear. Once, just after midnight, there was a deep, hollow thud that traveled up through the stone into my boots. I didn't need to check the logs to know what it meant. Another load path had failed. Then the environmental officer returned. She'd received reports of discoloration downstream from the bridge. I walked her to the bank and showed her the footage I'd already pulled. Diesel dripping from overfilled tanks. Hydraulic fluid misting off fittings. Concrete wash sloughing off tires directly into the water. She took samples in silence, bagged them, and thanked me for my cooperation. A week later, she called to confirm elevated contamination levels consistent with fuel and cement runoff. Remediation would be required. Responsibility would be assigned. I added the report to the file. By then, I was sleeping lightly. Not from anxiety, but from readiness. I needed to be awake when it happened, not to stop it, but to respond correctly. I rehearsed the calls in my head. Emergency services. County officials, Marissa. Environmental response. The sequence mattered. Timing mattered. Residents of Redwillow Ridge started to notice things too. Lights flickered during heavy crossings. Water pressure dipped briefly in the mornings. Internet connections dropped and came back without explanation. Lydia dismissed the complaints as construction-related inconveniences. Temporary. Normal. Necessary. She was right about one thing. It was temporary. What she didn't understand was that the system was no longer degrading gradually. It had crossed into an unstable regime. Each overload didn't just add damage, it amplified the effect of the next. Once a structure reaches that point, the failure window narrows rapidly. From an engineering standpoint, the bridge was operating on borrowed integrity. I reviewed the logs one evening and saw a pattern shift. Crossings were closer together. Loads slightly higher. There was urgency in the data. Someone had moved up a deadline, a promised opening date. A financing trigger. Whatever it was pushing Brent to run trucks harder and Lydia to keep approving it. That's when I knew the end was near. I walked the bridge at dawn the next morning and felt the difference underfoot. Not dramatic, just a subtle lack of resistance, like a muscle finally giving out after being pushed too long. I checked the conduit access points out of habit. The faint hiss of water was still there. Power demand was peaking as the neighborhood woke up. Everything was flowing through stone that had already exceeded its design life. The bridge had done everything it was supposed to do. It had warned. It had flexed. It had redistributed load until there was nowhere left for the force to go. There was nothing heroic left to be done, only observation. I set my phone to alert mode and stood back from the span. The trucks kept coming. The numbers kept climbing. And with each crossing, I felt the countdown tighten, not in seconds, but in probabilities. From that point on, every load was a coin toss, and physics doesn't care how much pressure someone is under when it decides the game is over. Tuesday, 6:30 in the morning. I knew it was different the moment the vibration reached me. The frequency was lower, heavier, like the ground itself was bracing. When Brent's largest cement mixer came into view, I checked my phone without thinking. The weight sensors had already tripped. The number on the screen was higher than anything I'd logged before, not by a little. By enough to erase whatever margin the bridge still had left. The truck slowed at the edge of the span. For a brief second I thought the driver might turn around. Then the drum rotated, the engine growled, and the front wheels rolled onto the stone. The bridge answered immediately. There was a sharp, unmistakable report as a primary shear plane failed near the center span. Not a warning sound, a conclusion. The stone shifted visibly, a fraction of an inch, and the load redistributed faster than the remaining structure could absorb. Mortar that had been holding compressive force for a century suddenly took tensile stress it was never meant to bear. Then the center dropped. The failure was total and violent. The middle section of the bridge collapsed straight down, pulling 15 tons of wet concrete with it into Pine Hollow Creek. Steel reinforcement screamed as it snapped. The truck lurched sideways, rear wheels lifting before slamming down at an angle. Water and slurry erupted upward in a choking gray plume that coated the banks and poured downstream. For half a second, there was silence. Then everything screamed at once. The truck's alarms blared uncontrollably. My phone lit up with alerts. Sensor failures, utility disruptions, load exceedance logs, all time-stamped within seconds of one another. The creek churned as concrete began to set where it shouldn't. The smell of diesel hit the air. I called emergency services immediately and stepped back. This was no longer a structure. It was a scene. Within minutes, the consequences rippled outward. Redwillow Ridge went dark in sections, then completely. Power dropped. Water pressure failed. Internet connections vanished. Garage doors froze halfway open. Security systems started chirping uselessly. Residents spilled into the streets, phones held up, trying to understand why everything they depended on had shut off at once. Emergency crews arrived fast, but access was already compromised. The usual routes were blocked. Utility teams followed, then environmental response units. And right on cue, local reporters pulled in behind them, cameras rolling. Disasters have a way of announcing themselves. Lydia arrived shortly after. She stood on the far bank in the same blazer she'd worn to every meeting, but it didn't look like armor anymore. She stared at the collapsed span, then at the truck half submerged in the creek, concrete hardening around its tires. Her phone vibrated nonstop in her hand. Calls she couldn't answer. Messages she didn't need to read to know what they said. County officials didn't sugarcoat it. They explained that the bridge wasn't just a private crossing. It was a utility corridor. Multiple lines had been severed. Emergency rerouting would require permits, environmental review, and time. Cleanup alone would take months. Reconstruction costs were already climbing into numbers that made people shift their weight uncomfortably. Millions. Lydia opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. She looked around, searching for someone to push back against, someone to reframe the situation for. The residents watching from a distance weren't sympathetic. They were scared, angry, very aware that their homes were without basic services because someone had decided schedules mattered more than limits. That's when Marissa stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a speech. She handed the lead county official a binder and said, calmly, "This is everything you'll need." Inside were weeks of footage showing repeated trespass. Load logs, documenting systematic overload. Structural assessments tying damage directly to commercial traffic. Environmental reports confirming contamination from fuel and concrete runoff. Utility maps showing the bridge's role as a critical infrastructure node. Then came the last section. Development proposals. Investor presentations. Written assurances of utility capacity. Lydia didn't own and had no authority to promise. The tone changed immediately. Investigators pulled Brent aside. His truck sat useless in the creek, concrete setting around it like a cast. He looked small, standing there, soaked and silent, answering questions that were no longer hypothetical. Lydia tried once to speak. She started with something about unforeseen circumstances, about aging infrastructure. One of the officials stopped her gently and told her this wasn't the time for explanations. It was the time for accountability. She didn't say another word after that. Cameras kept rolling. Residents whispered. News alerts began hitting phones as nearby towers picked up the story. By the end of the morning, everyone in Redwillow Ridge knew exactly why their lights were out and their water wasn't running. I stood back from the creek and watched the bridge my grandfather built finally come to rest where physics said it would. Not in anger, not in triumph, in relief. The waiting was over. The warnings were no longer theoretical. The bridge hadn't failed unexpectedly. It had done exactly what it was always going to do once its limits were ignored long enough. Lydia hadn't destroyed my legacy. She'd documented her own decisions in the most public way possible. And from that moment on, there was no version of the story she could control anymore. The fallout didn't unfold slowly. It cascaded. Once the emergency crews stabilized the site and the initial shock wore off, the machinery of accountability started moving with a momentum Lydia could no longer manage. Investigations that would normally take months were expedited. Utility companies filed incident reports. Environmental agencies issued formal notices. The county sealed off the area and assigned responsibility before the concrete in the creek had fully set. Brent's problems surfaced first. Investigators didn't just focus on the collapsed bridge. They widened the scope. Route logs, vehicle weights, prior violations, unauthorized access points. Patterns emerged quickly. His company had been cutting corners long before my bridge failed. This time, the evidence was impossible to bury. Within weeks, his construction license was suspended pending review. Contracts were frozen. Crews were sent home. The same shortcuts that had saved him time and money were now itemized as liabilities. Lydia tried to hold the narrative together for as long as she could. She sent emails to residents explaining that the outage was temporary and that the situation was under control. She emphasized cooperation, patience, trust in leadership. But that language didn't land the same way when people were hauling bottled water up driveways and resetting spoiled refrigerators. Fear has a way of sharpening memory. Residents remembered the complaints they'd filed, the warnings they'd heard dismissed, the trucks they'd watched cross that bridge day after day. An emergency HOA meeting was called less than a week later. Not the polished, agenda-driven kind Lydia favored, but a raw one. People spoke out of turn. Voices shook. Questions were asked that had no comfortable answers. When someone finally motioned to remove Lydia as head of the HOA, there wasn't an argument. The vote passed quietly. Lydia didn't protest. She didn't accuse. She gathered her things and walked out of the room without looking back. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked less like a professional under pressure and more like someone who had underestimated how quickly responsibility can catch up. The county's findings were released shortly after. The collapse was officially attributed to repeated commercial overload and unauthorized use of private infrastructure. The HOA was assigned full financial responsibility for environmental cleanup, utility restoration, and reconstruction. There was no ambiguity in the language, no room for reinterpretation. The bridge rebuild became a public process. Because of its age and historical significance, preservation boards got involved. Environmental reviews dictated the methods. Utility companies coordinated rerouting plans. I was invited into the process not as a plaintiff, but as a consultant. I insisted on honoring my grandfather's original design while incorporating modern reinforcement. Stone-faced, proper load distribution, improved drainage, protected conduit channels rated far beyond anything an HOA contractor could abuse again. This time, everything was documented. Permanent easements were recorded. Weight limits codified, access restrictions written into county records. The bridge wasn't just rebuilt, it was insulated from future interpretations. Redwillow Ridge changed in quieter ways too. People who had avoided eye contact before started stopping by my workshop. Some apologized outright. Others admitted they'd been afraid to speak up when Lydia was in charge. Pressure doesn't need everyone's consent. It only needs enough silence. Losing power and water made that silence impossible to justify anymore. I reopened the shop without fanfare. Orders trickled back, then picked up. Mornings returned to the smell of sawdust and oil instead of diesel and exhaust. The alarm stayed silent. The logs stopped filling. The new HOA leadership didn't chase expansion. They focused on repair, transparency, and boring meetings that ended on time. That was a victory in itself. When the bridge finally reopened, it looked much like it always had. Stone arch, solid parapet, creek flowing steadily beneath. Only I knew how much stronger it was now, how carefully its limits had been respected and protected. I walked it the same way I always had. Slow steps, hand on the stone. Listening. The bridge felt quiet again. Not because nothing was moving through it, but because nothing was being forced. Lydia once believed strength meant pushing until something gave. The bridge taught everyone a different lesson. Strength lasts when limits are understood. And when they're respected, nothing needs to break to prove it. I still walk that bridge every morning. Not to inspect it, not to listen for warning signs. Just to cross it the way my grandfather intended, calmly, deliberately, with respect for what it carries and what it doesn't. The creek moves beneath it the same way it always has. The stone feels steady underfoot, quiet again. This was never about winning. It was about understanding. My grandfather taught me that real strength isn't found in pushing harder. It's found in knowing limits and honoring them. He believed that if you build something honestly, it will tell you the truth long before it fails. You just have to be willing to listen. Lydia's thought power came from pressure, from deadlines, from forcing reality to bend because schedules demanded it. She wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. She was desperate to keep everything moving, convinced that slowing down meant losing control. What she learned, too late, is that preparation always outlasts intimidation, and that physics doesn't negotiate. Silence protects abuse because it hides patterns. Documentation ends it because it exposes them. Dates, weights, reports. Footage. Facts don't argue. They simply wait. If you're ever dealing with an HOA that thinks rules replace respect, remember this: authority without accountability eventually collapses under its own weight. Stone lasts longer than arrogance. Records outlive threats. This bridge still stands not because I fought harder, but because I waited, measured, and let the truth speak when it mattered most. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?